And you see, the issue is we are no longer in a world where the average person learns how to play an instrument simply so after dinner you can have a good time. If you want to get back to the world where people storytelled, where people created spaces that made houses into homes, that made communities feel like communities versus a collection of random stores, then you must go through philosophy. You must go through that of which remove people from their belonging to return to belonging.
Again, I sometimes think it's just a massive mistake that philosophy gets associated with these big metaphysical questions like what is freedom, what is justice? And don't get me wrong, those questions matter. But there's something about philosophy that is opening the possibility space so that you can think more possibilities. And if your life feels stuck, if you don't know what to do, that's a really handy skill. And like Michelle was saying, yeah, we can talk all day about romanticizing your life and enchanting your life. But if you don't, but nobody wants their life not to be enchanted, right? Nobody wants their life not to be romantic. And you see, if it isn't, then it's probably the case that out of the options you have in your scope, the option's not there to re-enchant it. So what you need to do is widen the aperture. Mm-hmm. And philosophy, by asking silly questions or thinking silly thoughts like, what is salt? What is a relationship? It actually does that. It opens up possibility. But critically, I guess I would add this, and I'm happy to discuss anything this evening, including what is carrot juice, to continue the theme. Like philosophy adds a choice that's not merely adding to your list of choices, like chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, ice cream, right? That's adding choice. Philosophy more expands the horizon of the kinds of questions you can ask. So it's not merely another option amidst the questions you already ask, but it asks like a different kind of question you can ask about things. Like, you know, when you think about your spouse or your husband or whoever, it's like, how could they think that way? You know, philosophy might ask you instead of how could they think that way in the kind of mean way? It's like, no, like actually ask that. How can they think that way? Why do they think that way? And that completely transforms your orientation to the situation, which increases freedom and agency. And I think basically the nature of human life is to end up in stuck situations, Nash equilibria, where your good ideas get you in an enclosure that you don't know how to get out of it. The course of life is such that you basically inevitably end up in a place where you feel stuck, where you don't know how to get out. And since that's inevitable, given just we're talking the natural way we approach problems, then there will eventually come a time where you need the ability to open the aperture about how you think about situations and the kind of questions you ask. And if you can't do that, you're stuck. And philosophy is way more about that than it is, in my opinion, it's way more about that than it is esoteric, obscure questions about substance, essence. Although those things, I mean, I would also add those big questions, though, come up when you follow the classical dialogues from people trying to expand the horizon of possibility in their life because they were stuck. They didn't get into all that difficult metaphysics stuff because they were bored one day and wanted to do it. They found themselves having to get into that stuff in order to open up the horizon of possibility and to understand what was being opened up and to deal with, say, problems they didn't otherwise know how to deal with. So Michelle and I, we talk about that all the time. We think it has a big impact in relationships. So philosophize your life, people. It's important.
Which was just that unfortunately, I think philosophy is already tied to a very particular idea in people's minds that's going to be very hard to get away from. And it's very much associated with, you know, if I say philosophy to someone in my life who's not in these circles, my sense is they associate that, and I used to associate that with ancient philosophers and learning about who they were and reading their books and understanding their ideas about reality and how they differ, and that you should be able to sit down and have meaningful conversations with your friends about what's your position on Hegel, and you know, like that's what it is. And yes, also that it's about ideas that are more removed from common life. Yeah, you know, like big questions that really have nothing to do with how we conduct ourselves day to day. And in that sense, I think is seen as indulgent, luxurious, potentially irrelevant, and also that we've outgrown it somehow or something. I do think there's something to that.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a shame.
The person stops listening right there. It's just like, oh, you know,
Yeah. And for a lot of people, like I said to Michelle, I think they really do just think of old white men, like ancient Greece, in a toga, like, and they just think, what on earth has that got to, walking around in sandals, what has that got to do with me now? And so, and I do think there's something about it too that can be associated with like a preaching, like a preaching and like someone knows the answers and they're telling you, or and it's the same sort of error, modal error. It's like to engage in those conversations, I think is read these days as akin to an argument where someone has to win. And so it's like a power dynamic again, which is a shame,
I think so. I totally agree that the word philosophy has become a barrier to people, but there's also something I would say where there's this weird thing where I think theology is a barrier to people. People think you're interested in theology because you don't want to do the practical, you're just not the salt of the earth Christian who wants to be like Jesus. You want to get into all this fancy theology, right? Or if you mention sociology, I mean, people, oh my gosh, you're one of those power-hungry Foucaultians looking for power everywhere. It's like, no, by sociology, I have Peter Berger and people like that in mind. Literature, oh, that's pleasure, pastime, not practical. There's very few words now that are not barriers.
And psychology is manipulation. You want to manipulate people. Yeah,
that's correct. Like, there's very few words now that are not automatic shutdown. And the words that are not automatic shutdown are business, engineering, and maybe entrepreneurship. I mean, after the 2010s, but there's actually very few words that you can tell people you're going into and not get them to shut down. And that's because we're all kind of, in some respects, brainwashed by the zeitgeist of quantification and pragmatism, right? Like even words like politics. Oh my gosh, I hate politics. Why? I don't want to talk about politics. Why are you going into that? Right? Like, religion. Oh gosh, you're supposed to keep that to yourself, right? That's changing, you could argue a little bit, but it's always very interesting to me how few terms don't shut people down. Like, you're absolutely right that I think philosophy uniquely shuts people down. It's more intense, but it's also interesting how few terms don't shut people down. Once they hear them, it just shows that the human brain is kind of waiting.
What David Hume is describing is the meaning crisis, because you become melancholic because you can no longer relate. As you become melancholic, the great temptation of the philosopher is in their melancholy to deal with it by becoming resentful and self-important. So as you become melancholic, you can overcome that feeling by pride, by saying, I'm better than those people. Those people don't get it. And you give yourself a meaning and purpose by reforming those people. And so what he sees is philosophy births the tyrant. And actually, you get the tyrannical philosopher king, who is someone that thinks to philosopher has all the great ideas, and they're now going to fix all those common folk, right? And that's bad philosophy. So you have the thoughtlessness of common life, where you don't question anything, okay? And you get the bad philosophy gives you the philosophical tyrant. So you would hear that and say, well, I guess Mr. Hume is anti-philosophy, right? That sounds really, really bad. And he said, yeah, but here's the problem. In the common life, you end up with Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. You don't question anything, and guess what your common life is? Nazism. Your common life is white people are better than black people. Christians are better than other religions. Your common life makes it given that everyone but you is wrong, and it's given that you need to get rid of them, right? So you create violence. The other thing with common life is if you don't question anything and your king tells you to, give up your land or to take everything, you have no basis to question or defend yourself, right? Because you don't have thought and you don't have philosophy, right? So you need to develop philosophy. But wait, didn't you say philosophy drags us out of common life into philosophical melancholia and resentment? Yep, you have to go through it. You have to go through the melancholia. You have to go through the alienation. But here's the key. So you go from common life to the quote-unquote ivory tower. You leave common life to the ivory tower. You get a philosophical journey. The key step is to return to common life. You have to go from the ivory tower back to common life. How do you reintegrate, though? How do you reintegrate? You've ascended over it, and yet you nevertheless choose to go back to it. How do you do that, right? If you cannot do this, you cannot have a good philosophy. Now, ways that Hume gets at this is you see your role as the philosopher, and this will allude to Clayton's work, as basically defending the common life. You are using philosophy to keep out anyone that would try to manipulate it, anyone who would bring ideas on why it is wrong, anyone who would bring condemnation, tyrants, dictators, kings. You're using philosophy. Here's the key. David Hume understood philosophy deconstructed. You know how everyone's like the postmodern deconstructs and that's all the problem? He said, no, that's its weapon of self-defense. You can deconstruct anyone that comes in to destroy your common life. Because if they come in with ideas on why you're wrong, you can deconstruct it. Deconstruction was supposed to be used as a weapon of self-defense of a common life. That's what David Hume envisioned. He didn't use the language of deconstruction. That's abso-frickin-lutely what he's talking about. Deconstruction is how you defend your common life. What ended up happening is the weapon of deconstruction was realized later in the 20th century, and it was used, people used it on themselves. This is the, so philosophy, so David Hume in a sense sees philosophy as having a role in the society like the bread maker, like the blacksmith. I mean, people talk about the sense maker. That is kind of what Hume is getting at. You are there as a certain sense maker and a certain self-defender. And if you cannot do that, you're going to be in trouble. And Hume, you could argue, has been proven all the more right by the internet, interconnectivity. Like what Hume is describing is needed all the more because your grandfather will be watching the news. Your friends will be, you are now always already in the slough of information. So Hume is warning about this just with like the beginning of interconnect, like flowing of information. He's a historian. Like he's kind of warning about this at the beginning of globalization, right? And he's just seeing that as intensifying. Well, yeah, it intensified. So you need philosophy more than ever before. Oh, by the way, you're already philosophical. This is Peter Berger. It's too late now. You're philosophical. We're all existentialists now, right? So David Hume is like, yeah, if you're a philosopher, you really need to have that return then, because if you're not, you're either in melancholia or resentment, or you're trying to return to a thoughtlessness to regain belonging that's not possible. All of that is pathological, and it's going to end up in some Lacanian register that gets us all killed. So you have to have the return to common life. Well, how do you return to common life? You have to commit to something. You have to make an absolute choice. You have to believe that these people have value, and they do. Because you don't know everything. Like, it's funny how we use uncertainty to deconstruct worldviews. Well, how are we so certain that common life people or people who don't like this sort of stuff have nothing that can gain us, nothing that is there? There's actually a lot to be said on that topic, but I'll throw in this question of the right kind of philosophy. That's if your philosophy does not make space for therapy, if your philosophy does not make space for going home and having people that don't like philosophy and actually your ability to be with them is part of your philosophy, if your philosophy does not have something that is able to allow people not liking philosophy and that's actually good for you, then actually it's the wrong philosophy. And that's kind of, I think, starting to get at what Mr. Nelson was saying earlier. Like, if you have a philosophy that makes you better than people that don't do philosophy, it's the wrong philosophy because you can't return in that. Right? And if your philosophy does not have a philosophy of how the anxiety of dealing with the other is good for you, that's a problem. I think, no, you don't need philosophy if you people are playing guitar and sitting on the porch and having a good time. You don't need it at all if people are going to dance clubs and all that different things. Here's the problem. People don't do that anymore. They don't develop the skills to play guitar unless they're going to be a professional musician. You can't go to your local dance club anymore. There are. The loss of community, as Robert Putnam says, is not there. So why did it go away? I would argue because people didn't have a philosophical answer to why do it if it won't make you money. So there was the logic of quantification at the expense of quality. So because people didn't have philosophy, they weren't able to defend learning skills to simply have hobbies because life is better without them. And now they're not able to have story time after dinner because they're under what Ivan Illich said is disablement. And now you need philosophy in order to actually gain yourself the confidence to go learn a skill that won't make you money, precisely so you can be a more dynamic human being and bring people together after dinner on the porch instead of just watching TV. Because if you don't develop a philosophical defense of learning skills that you don't get paid for, you won't do it. And so you won't be able to actually create community that doesn't need philosophy. This is the problem we have. You need philosophy now to do the things you need to create the conditions that bring people together without philosophy, because there is a pernicious metaphysics always in the background that is convincing you that doing some things is not worth doing, and so you don't do them because you're not able to mentally defend yourself against that, and you end up only able to consume, only able to watch Netflix, not able to play music because you didn't develop that skill because you weren't going to get paid to do it. And so you're not able to create those spaces. So this is the tension now, and this is what Hume is getting at. Increasingly, the things we need to have community that doesn't need philosophy needs philosophy to get them, because there is a philosophy of the zeitgeist that convinces you gaining those skills and doing those things are needed. Great example, going to church How many people stopped going to church or being part of a religious community because they didn't have a defense of the faith? They weren't able to philosophically ground it, so they left. And now they're all freaking hikikomori. Like, because, okay, so in order to just stay, or doing Lions Club, or joining a bowling league, or all of these different things, why did communities stop investing in bowling leagues or communities building these things? Because it didn't make jobs, because it didn't increase the GDP, and they didn't have a philosophy or a argument against that way of thought. So it was, here's the key, rational to get rid of the bowling alley, rational to not develop the skills to play guitar, rational to not go to church. And so autonomous rationality led you to a world where now you need philosophy in order to get to that world where you don't need philosophy. That's the problem. And that's kind of the thing, because you need philosophy to avoid game theory problems, where everyone does what is rational and you end up in a suboptimal result. Okay, like you're describing it with the French word. So yeah, no, you need philosophy to not need philosophy. That's the problem we have now. You need philosophy to not need philosophy, right? Like the world's not enchanted, okay? Like Charles Taylor. So if you want to re-enchant it, you need philosophy in order to not need it. You have to go through philosophy. You have to go through the alienation. You have to go through the ability to, you have to be able to handle vast mental complexity in order to self-forget it. Like the only way you're going to enter flow states now is if you have the mental complexity to forget about your mental complexity. That's the problem. You can't in global pluralism get flow states, or I've frozen. Okay, you can't in global pluralism get self-forgetfulness or flow without going through philosophy. But here's the problem. Philosophy also takes you out of flow because it alienates you. So now you're thinking all the time, right? So in a way, thinking goes against self-forgetfulness and belonging and flow because you're thinking, so you're no longer flowing. But now you have to think to not think. You have to think to get into the flow. So you have to develop vast mental complexity so you can handle diversity, because diversity makes you question yourself and question everything you believe, right? So if you're not able to handle diversity, you're not going to have belonging or self-forgetfulness, because when you encounter otherness, you'll be taken out of it. And that's why everyone's returning to stuff like white nationalism, Christian nationalism, tribalizing with people that think like them, because if you can just be around people that think like you, the probability of getting snapped out of your self-forgetfulness goes down, because you're not going to encounter radical difference that makes you question yourself. And so everyone isolates apart. They try to fragment, because all the people now that are doing this whole friggin' return to fascism, small nation states or whatever, they were ignored. They said humans need belonging. People need to feel like they have identity. Like the Nick Futuris, all those people, like the new, like Nick Fuentes and all of that. People ignored them. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? People do need belonging. And if you don't figure out how to give it to them, they're going to get it. And you're not going to like how they get it. Because people need to feel social cohesion. They need social intelligibility. But the problem is, thought threatens social intelligibility, and now the only way to social intelligibility is through that which threatens it. The only way to return home is through alienation. It's like Dante. You have to go through hell to get to heaven now. You can't go up the hill the she lions up. You got to go the long way. Yes, we have to go the long way. We have to return, right? And you see, the issue is we are no longer in a world where the average person learns how to play an instrument simply so after dinner you can have a good time. If you want to get back to the world where people storytelled, where people created spaces that made houses into homes, that made communities feel like communities versus a collection of random stores, then you must go through philosophy. You must go through that of which remove people from their belonging to return to belonging. So that's why we need philosophy, because that's the only way back. And it turns out that philosophy is in the business of beauty anyway. In the ability, philosophy is about actually having the kind of subjectivity that can encounter otherness without losing yourself. Like you're able to encounter the other without undergoing self-deconstruction, self-effacement, and auto-cannibalism. And that's when you get harmony. That's when you get music. Because when the piano can encounter the cello and not lose its crap, but actually say, hey, you're different, and because of that difference, we can make harmony, now you have something beautiful. And in fact, the complexity and the difference affords a certain beauty and harmony that in history was never before possible. So this moment in history, the vast difficulty of the possibility of harmony is precisely why the beauty of that harmony can be so great if we can rise to its challenge. And the only way to rise to its challenge now is to go through philosophy and to go through complexification. I think also I'll just say...
but the patience component and how there is such a different way that we start to relate to pace and sitting and waiting for the other to find the words and speak the words, and kind of the way we sit back and the way we do that for ourselves. It's very different to day-to-day speak, where you're going somewhere and you're trying to get something done, and it's, and so I think very concrete everyday examples of how stepping into that way of being with our own thinking and doing that with another person, relating with another person, where you're both doing that, thinking about how that could transform some of these very mundane or often very conflictual day-to-day moments in relationships is really important. And what I find so beautiful about these conversations that I have, that I've come to see is actually the essence of philosophy. That's what I think anyway. Is that anyone can take part in them. And by taking part in them, it's like that rising tide thing. I can't think of what the expression is right now, but you bring everyone along with you. So it is actually through, it's a loving act like that. And that's why I think the relationship bit is so key. And I really do see it more as something that's akin to the wisdom of friendship, because it makes, I'm just going to say some simple things. It makes every relationship better, just in the attempt. Just for one person to even take the attempt of stepping into slightly that mode of being in the conversation with the other person, noticing something come up and approach questioning it in that way, as opposed to a different kind of way that we often get stuck in, of more like an interrogation or a quick judgment or a dismissal. Even just in that attempt, even if it's not met well, I really do think that's a better taking care of the potential of that relationship, and therefore the potential of all of us involved. It's a much more caring, loving way of treating others and treating ourselves and treating the potential of relationships. And that doesn't mean it always goes well, and it doesn't mean that even in our attempt to do it, we can do it really badly. And actually, it doesn't do, but even having that alive in our mind, that to me, that is kind of the heart of what we're talking about here. And that is very, very different from thinking that it's about learning about all the ways that different conceptions of existence and who we are in the universe, formed and changed over time, and the departing, like that's all. I find that fascinating because I love stuff like that. It's the same with, theology, and I love to think like, and what year did they break off and why, what was different there? And like, I love to map, but that's got nothing to do with the actual activity of philosophy. That's kind of learning the roots of it, which is still important. But I don't think you need to know those things to start taking part in it. You can start taking part in it like now.